students, I welcome you all to my today's session, which is on an introduction to social stratification. As you know that social stratification is one of the most foundational and one of the most important concepts that we discuss in sociology. And in most sociology textbooks, you will find that the term social stratification is often used loosely to mean social inequality. So, in this particular module, we will try to understand the precise meaning of the term social stratification and why it is important in sociology. And basically, the module will be divided into two parts. So, first we will deal with what is social stratification. It will deal with a conceptual analysis of the term, and then we will move over to understand some of the theoretical contributions to social stratification. We will begin now with the first part, which is the conceptual analysis of social stratification. Social stratification is a term which is usually used to refer to a systematic rank ordering through which a society is divided. Now, in this definition, it is important to note the term systematic rank ordering. So, there is a systematic way in which hierarchies are generated within society, and that is what social stratification and the study of social stratification focuses on. How does this systematic hierarchization of social groups happen? Another way of defining social stratification could be that it includes the process of assignment to positions within an established social order and hierarchy. So, as you know, the usual forms of social stratification include class, caste, gender, race. It also includes disability, sexuality, etc. So, first we will begin with how do we understand the term more precisely. So, is it same as social inequality or is it different? And if we make a finer distinction between social inequality and social stratification, what will it allow us to do? What is the analytical value of this distinction? So, Dipankar Gupta has coined the term social stratification to mean that it includes both the concepts of hierarchy and difference. So, he introduces these two concepts, hierarchy and difference, to understand social stratification. And he argues that social inequality would simply mean a hierarchy. On the other hand, social stratification would mean both hierarchy and difference. So, basically he is trying to make a distinction between two forms of stratification. What are these? The first is based on a ranked scale where inequality is the defining feature. It is fundamentally based on inequality. For example, the class stratification. There is no way we can imagine class rather than as a hierarchical system, and therefore it is fundamentally based on inequality. The second kind of social ordering that he talks about, however, is based on difference, and this would include stratification based on gender as well as other kinds of categorizations like differences and hierarchization of race or hierarchization based on language differences and so on and so forth. So, in case of these forms of stratification, there is inequality which emerges out of the fundamental concept of difference. So, he would argue that in the first kind of stratification, such as class stratification, it resembles a geological stratification, where each layer is placed on top of another. On the other hand, in case of the second kind of stratification, such as gender relations for example, it is a horizontal model of stratification where the categories are all placed on the same plane, and it is different from the geological model of stratification, which is a vertical model of stratification. Here is a table where I have put the forms of stratification which are fundamentally based on hierarchy on the left side, and I have put the forms of stratification which are fundamentally based on difference on the right side of the table. On the left side you will see stratification systems such as class, rank, power, etc., which is supposed to be based on hierarchy. And there is no way we can imagine these forms of stratification apart from the hierarchical division. On the right side of the table, you will see the kinds of stratification which are fundamentally based on difference. And this would include gender stratification, race, religious groups, linguistic divisions, regional divisions, sexuality, and so on. For Dipankar Gupta, social stratification implies both social inequality and social differentiation. So, in case of social stratification which are fundamentally based on differences, what is crucial is to recognize that the differences ultimately get translated into hierarchy. For example, in case of gender relations, it is fundamentally based on difference between males and females which get translated into an hierarchy. So, as sociologists, we need to understand how these processes of how the difference gets translated into hierarchy. That is something which is more important and more interesting for a sociologist to look at. So, gender relations is something which needs to be understood as fundamentally based on difference which gets translated into hierarchy. And the next particular conceptual distinction that Dipankar Gupta points out, that all natural differences, however, do not get translated into any form of social stratification. So, for example, differences in age, height, weight, etc. In case of race, however, it is a natural difference which gets translated into social stratification. So, the natural difference of skin color becomes the basis of a systematic discrimination, and therefore it is a form of social stratification. Skin color becomes then the basis of ethnic discrimination, and this is a systematic form of discrimination which operates across societies. However, in case of caste, there is also a relevance of understanding the natural differences. So, in case of caste, there are certain beliefs that natural differences exist between different caste groups. However, it is also important to keep in mind that there are certain social stratifications which are not based on natural differences, they do not have any natural basis, but yet they tend to be naturalized. For example, caste differences. So, these ideas emerge such as poor people deserve to be poor. So, these forms of ideas justify class as a natural phenomena based on natural differences. And now we move over to another fundamental difference that Dipankar Gupta is making to understand the relevance of social stratification, which is the difference between social statics and social dynamics. So, he is arguing that if we try to understand social stratification based on differences, it will actually allow us to grasp the processes of social change. So, it is important to understand for us that the processes of contestation that happen over ranking based on differences, and these contestations are based on power relations. In case of stratification based on hierarchy, you will notice there is usually a single basis of gradation, and this basis of gradation is universally accepted and it is a legitimate basis. So, there is no dispute over the basis of the hierarchy. In case of other forms of stratification, however, which are fundamentally based on difference, there is a continuous dispute and continuous contestation over the criteria of the hierarchy. So, these gradations are ultimately backed by power relations and it keeps on changing. So, therefore, Dipankar Gupta is trying to say that for us as a sociologist, it is more important to look at social stratification based on difference rather than those which are based on hierarchy. Because if we focus on social stratifications which are based on difference, and we know that there is a continuous contestation over the criteria of the hierarchy that is built there in case of those forms of stratification, it will help us to understand change, and therefore it will help us to understand the theme of social dynamics. Dipankar Gupta also discusses the differences between open system of stratification and closed system of stratification. So, while discussing these systems of stratification, we can keep in mind that class societies can be taken as a representative of an open system of stratification and caste societies can be seen as closed system of stratification. So, let us discuss some of the features of these two forms of stratificatory systems. So, in case of open system, mobility is something which is an accepted property of such a stratificatory system. On the other hand, in case of a closed system, mobility is something which is strongly discouraged. Second, mobility is possible through individual initiative and effort in an open system. But in case of a closed system, individual mobility is almost impossible. So, in case of caste, for example, there can be processes of acquiring group mobility as a caste group, but it is not possible to think of individual mobility within such a system. Third, the hierarchy in case of an open system is firm because it is based on a legitimate ground, an accepted ground, and the individuals may, however, move up and down the ladder. In case of a closed system, if mobility is sought, then often it results in ideological battles and ideological wars. Only through contestations over ideology, social mobility is possible in case of closed system. Fourth, it is basically a hierarchy which is based on quantitative indicators in case of open systems. In case of closed system, on the other hand, it is basically based on qualitative criteria. Fifth, since there is an accepted and legitimate basis of hierarchy, it is a stable system. In case of closed system, however, the criteria of hierarchy is continuously disputed and there is a continuous contestation over the criteria of the hierarchy. And lastly, it is in an open system, it is fundamentally based on hierarchy, and in a closed system, it is fundamentally based on differences first and then hierarchy. So, in case of closed system, emphasis is on maintaining hierarchies, and in case of closed system, there will be a continuous contestation over the basis of hierarchy. However, we have to keep in mind that at the empirical level, societies often represent a combination of open and closed systems of stratification. For example, as we see that in India, caste and class coexist as forms of stratification today. Dipankar Gupta also talks about the porousness of open systems of stratification, how open systems of stratification may not be as open as they look like. So, how do we understand the porousness of these open systems of stratification? How in class societies, nevertheless, status remains very, very important, and differences and distinctions based on status is closely safeguarded. So, how status is determined by lifestyles, comportment and habits of particular social groups in order to reinforce their social status, and Bourdieu and Weber are two of the key theorists who have analyzed the importance of status as a form of stratification, and race relations are fundamentally governed by status considerations, and differences and demarcations based on status differences. So, race as a social reality in case of America shows how distinctions are maintained even in a society which is seen as an open system of stratification. And now we move over to the second part of our discussion today, which is on the theories of social stratification. And we will discuss three fundamental theoretical traditions here. First is the theories of the classical period, and there we will discuss the theories of Marx and Weber, and then we will move over to discussing the functionalist theory of social stratification, and finally we will discuss the feminist theory of social stratification. So, Marx's theory of social stratification basically focuses on class as a form of social stratification. Marx defines class in terms of the ownership of the means of production. In other words, according to Marx, at every stage of society there are two fundamental classes that emerge. Those who own the means of production, that is the tools, machinery, factory labor, etc., which are needed for production, and those who do not own the means of production. So, for Marx, the key classes in the capitalist mode of production would include the bourgeois and the proletariat, that is the capitalists and the landless wage workers. And these classes are always in conflict with each other because one is an exploiter class and the other is the exploited class. So, the peculiarity of Marx's definition is that it does not take income or occupation as the basis of class position, but one's position, according to him, is fundamentally based on the production process. Thus, two men can be carpenters. One may have a small shop which he owns and produces his own products, and the other may be employed in a factory making furniture. So, according to Marx, these two men will belong to two different classes, because in the former case he owns the means of production, and in the latter case he does not own the means of production. And now we move on to another conceptualization of the classical period, which is that of Weber. Now, unlike Marx, Weber is distinguishing three different axes of stratification. And what are these? Class, status and party. So, basically class refers to the different distribution of opportunities in the market, and for Weber, status on the other hand refers to the different distribution of social honor, and parties refers to basically the distribution of power in society. So, coming to his idea of class, Weber's distinctive idea of class. So, basically it focuses on market relations as opposed to production relations, and market is something that primarily determines class relations, and it gives the following definition of class. A class comes to be formed when a number of people have in common a specific causal component of their life chances, insofar as this component is represented exclusively by economic interests in the possession of goods and opportunities for income, and is represented under conditions of commodity or labor market. So, as you can see that in this definition, it is the market which ultimately determines the class position of a particular individual. So, it depends on how one uses one's goods or services in the market to exchange or get returns from the market, and this ultimately determines his class position. Weber defines status as the following, and I quote him: "Every typical component of the life fate of men that is determined by a specific, positive or negative social estimation of honor." Thus, you can see it is the concept of social honor which is central to his definition of status. It is something which determines one's social status as opposed to market which determines one's social class. So, class situation may determine one's status distinction as well, but not necessarily. So, Weber will argue that it is not necessarily that one's class situation will overlap with one's status situation. And Weber points out that status distinctions are basically based on distinctive styles of life, which may include the sense of dressing, manners, rituals of eating, and so on and so forth. And he also draws attention to the importance of rituals in case of social status distinctions which are based on religious grounds such as the caste system. And finally, he talks about party, which refers to the distribution of power. For Weber, parties may range from holding of power in a state or to that in a social club. And now we move over to the functionalist theories of stratification. The functionalist theorists such as Davis and Moore justify social stratification in terms of its positive outcome for society. So, basically they see social stratification as the mechanism through which society encourages individuals to seek to achieve the diverse positions which differ in terms of skill, education, intelligence, commitment, etc. So, basically they believe that in a stratified society, the most difficult positions are rewarded accordingly so that they are filled. So, social stratification basically acts as a motivation system for encouraging the most able people to perform the most demanding roles. Parsons, for example, is one theorist of social stratification, functionalist theorist of social stratification, and he identifies three sets of characteristics as a basis of social ranking: possessions or attributes that people own, qualities belonging to individuals which would include traits such as ascribe, characteristics of race, lineage, sex which are attributed as permanent characteristics, and finally performances or the evaluations of the way in which individuals have fulfilled their roles. And finally, we come to the feminist theories of stratification, and the feminists have challenged the male-centric notions of stratification, and they point out that understanding class stratification in a way where women are primarily said to have derived class position, which is determined by the occupational experience of the man, is something that one needs to do away with. One of the important thinkers of this tradition, Joan Acker, suggests that there are 5 shortcomings of the conventional male-centric notion of social stratification, and these are the assumption that family is a unit of class analysis, that social position of the family is determined by the occupation of the head of the household, which is usually a male, that the male is necessarily the head of the household, and that women living with a man nonetheless determine their own class. And finally, the assumption that inequalities between men and women are inherent and inevitable. So, in this particular module on social stratification, we have basically looked at the meaning of social stratification, and we have also looked at some of the theories of social stratification. We have discussed the concept of social stratification to understand how it is different from the concept of social inequality and why is it relevant for sociology to make this distinction. And in the second part of the module, we have discussed the three main theoretical frameworks to understand social stratification: the classical, functionalist and the feminist. And we need to understand that social stratification remains one of the fundamental concepts in sociology today, which basically looks at the systematic way in which societies are stratified across the various criteria of class, caste, race, religion, sexuality and so on. Sociology seeks to understand both the existing systems of stratification and also the changes that are brought about in these existing systems of stratification. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I look forward to seeing you all in my next session. Thank you.